On the freezing cold night of February 8th, 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan sat around this roaring fire with a big group of men inside of this valley in western Colorado. The men around the fire, including Israel, were all gold prospectors, which meant they traveled the western United States looking for gold. But over the past several weeks, this group of prospectors had been trapped in this valley because of all the terrible winter storms. They had these storms coming in that each time would dump up to 6 feet of snow. But on this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire, enjoying the flames and hearing people tell stories, one of Israel's friends, one of the other gold prospectors, whose name was Alfred Packer, he stood up and basically pitched the whole group as to why they should come with him and leave the valley right now. Basically, Alfred told the group that, the weather is starting to turn a bit, it's not as bad anymore, the snow's starting to melt, and Alfred said, I know a pathway out of here that will take us out of this valley in just 2 weeks, and it'll bring us right to Breckenridge, Colorado, which was an area that was known by prospectors for having lots and lots of gold. And so Alfred's basically telling them, this is a win-win. We can get out of here sooner and we can get rich. After Alfred made this pitch, he sat back down and everybody just stayed quiet for a second. And Israel, he kind of looked around and watched to see if anybody would take Alfred up on his proposition. Now, Israel knew, unlike him, most of the other prospectors didn't like Alfred. They said he was lazy and difficult. But Israel felt like that was really not the reason they did not like his friend. He believed the reason other people did not like Alfred was because Alfred had epilepsy, which meant he periodically had seizures. And because he had seizures, it kind of made him a liability for journeys like this, where, the whole group really needs to rely on everybody, and everybody needs to pull their own weight. And so they were kind of worried about a guy who, at any moment, could just become kind of useless because he was having a seizure. But for Israel, Alfred's epilepsy really didn't matter. He didn't feel like Alfred was some huge liability. He felt like Alfred was actually very smart and quite bold. And so for him to stand up and make this pitch just kind of felt like in keeping with who he was. He was somebody that wanted to get things done, and Israel liked that about him. However, just because Israel liked Alfred, that didn't mean he was just going to naturally go with Alfred and do his big plan, but he was at least thinking about it. And as Israel was weighing out the pros and cons of, whether or not he should go with Alfred, he happened to look across the fire and he saw one of the men, this really big guy, was sitting there looking really serious and just shaking his head slowly back and forth, like, no, you guys can't be considering leaving early. And then the big guy stood up and he held out his hand right in front of Alfred, basically telling him, like, don't say another word. And then this guy, while still looking at Alfred, he said, if you leave right now, all of your friends will die. And then this big guy sat back down again, and then everybody around the fire just sat there really tense for a few seconds in total silence. The big man who had just spoken was not a gold prospector. He was actually very different than the rest of the people sitting around this fire. His name was Eerie, and he was a Native American chief of the Tabawatch band of the Ute tribe. And Chief Eerie had actually saved the lives of everybody, Israel and Alfred included, who was sitting around this fire. Because a few weeks earlier, this whole group of gold prospectors had wound up lost in this valley, which was the valley where Chief Eerie lived with his tribe, and he had found them stumbling around on the brink of death with all the snow coming down. And so Chief Eerie and his people brought the prospectors some food and water. They helped them set up a campsite right near a river. And then Chief Eerie told them to stay put in this campsite and ride out the winter, and then in the springtime, when the snow melts, it'll be safe for you all to leave. Now, at first, the gold prospectors were only thankful and just totally psyched that Chief Eerie had found them and given them this campsite. I mean, this was great. And so they had no problem agreeing to, wait until the spring to finally leave. But now, after several weeks of being kind of trapped in this camp, the whole group was really starting to get restless. They were worried if they didn't leave soon, there'd be no more gold for them to mine. And for Israel specifically, there was even more pressure on him to go out and find gold, because he had told his family that this would be his last treasure hunting adventure ever. And so he really couldn't go home empty-handed. He literally needed the gold in order to continue to survive and take care of his family. So when Alfred stood up and broke the kind of tense silence and said to Chief Eerie, thank you for your concern, but I am going to leave early, and I just hope others will come with me. At that point, Israel saw the conviction in Alfred, and Israel really felt like he did need to leave now. He needed to get that gold. And so Israel said, you know what? I'll go with you as well. And then after Israel said he would go, 4 other gold prospectors also volunteered to leave early with Alfred. Chief Ure could tell he was not going to change any of these guys' minds. And so even though he felt like this was a terrible idea, he shifted his focus from trying to stop them to just trying to give them as much information as he could about the area they were going to go into. And so he called all the volunteers who'd be leaving early over to him, and then Chief Ure drew a map in the dirt on the ground, and he told Alfred and Israel and the other 4 volunteers that you have to follow the river out of here. It'll bring you to this mountain range called the San Juan Mountain Range, and you cannot attempt to go over those mountains. You will not make it. You gotta follow that river and go around the mountain range. And then once you do, on the other side, there will be an outpost where you can stop, get supplies, rest, and then continue the rest of the way towards Breckenridge. And then after Chief Ure had explained all this, he made sure to mark an X on his dirt map exactly where the outpost would be. And then Chief Ure just turned around and walked over to his horse and rode away. And then shortly after that, Alfred, Israel, and the rest of the gold prospectors also turned in for the night. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers who were going to be going on this journey, they got up early and began packing up their stuff. And as they did, one of the other gold prospectors who had not volunteered to go with them, who would be staying in the valley until the springtime, he actually came forward and said he would help them carry their supplies as far as he could go, using his horse. But at some point he would need to stop, drop off their stuff, and then they would be on their own. And so the men were very thankful about this. And so shortly after eating breakfast, they were all ready to go, and they hit the trail. As Israel and the rest of the prospectors began to hike their way up and out of the valley, they began to see off in the distance the huge jagged mountains of the San Juan mountain range, but they were careful to kind of veer closer to the north to stay along that river path because they knew they were not supposed to go up and over the mountains. And as Israel trudged through the snow in a line of men, he held on to a coffee pot, a metal coffee pot that he kept hot coals inside of. This not only kept his hands warm, but also, if he ran out of matches, he could easily start a fire using the coals. It was an old trick he had learned. And so as he's clutching this magnificent warm coffee pot in the freezing cold weather, Israel heard someone walking up behind him, and so he turned around and he saw it was Alfred. And he looked totally miserable, way more miserable than Israel was. And so without even thinking about it, Israel just handed off his warm coffee pot to Alfred. And Alfred took it and clutched it and was obviously so thankful. Now, none of these gold prospectors had struck it rich. They were all basically poor. But of all these gold prospectors, Alfred really had the least of all of them. And as a result, Israel kind of felt protective of Alfred. And also, Alfred was half the age of Israel. Alfred was 30 years old. And so Israel kind of viewed Alfred as like a lost kid trying to find his way. Alfred had also confided in Israel that when the Civil War broke out in the United States, Alfred had attempted to join the Union Army on 2 different occasions because he wanted to fight the slave-holding Confederate Army. But in both cases, they kicked Alfred out for his epilepsy. But that had not stopped Alfred from tattooing on his arm his battalion information and his name. And unfortunately, because Alfred could not read or write, he misspelled his name when he gave it to the tattoo artist. And so when he got the tattoo, it did not say Alfred for his first name. It said Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D. And from that point on, that was his name. Nobody called him Alfred, they called him Alfred. And so this was kind of embarrassing for him. And then after getting rejected from the military, Alfred had kind of bounced around from one job to the next, never really putting his roots down and never starting a family. And so again, Israel just felt like this was a guy who needed some help. And so after Alfred very happily accepted that coffee pot from Israel, he in turn reached into his jacket and pulled out a flask with some alcohol in it, and he handed it to Israel, almost like a thank you for giving me this warm coffee pot. And then the 2 friends walked side by side for a while, passing back and forth the flask and the coffee pot. And then by late afternoon that day, when the snow was really starting to come down, the prospector who had volunteered to use his horse to help move some of their supplies, he had finally reached a point where he said, my horse can't go any farther, the weather's too bad. And so he dropped all their supplies and then returned and headed back down the trail. And very likely, as these men watched him disappear down the trail, they all had the same thought. I just gotta suck it up for 2 weeks to get through this treacherous journey, and I will get to Breckenridge, and I will become rich. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Taking care of our mental health is no longer considered a taboo subject. However, actually asking for help when you are the one who's struggling feels just as taboo as ever. There's this fear that you'll be viewed as weak if you ask for help and show a side of you that's kind of vulnerable, when in reality, it's really the opposite. Asking for help when you need it shows strength. And if you do it, it's like right away, your life will improve. The second you let somebody else in, things are going to get better. I can say confidently that if I had not allowed somebody into my life, a therapist, back in 2018 when I was totally depressed, I don't know if I'd still be here. I was going down a very dark path, and I fundamentally believe therapy is what saved my life. Look, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you're struggling right now, I would really encourage you to give it a try. Plus, with the new year having just happened, now is a great time to finally take the plunge and give therapy a shot. And a great therapy platform, especially for people who have never used therapy before, is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey online, and then it's up to you how you communicate with your therapist, whether it's through messaging, video, or phone call, or some combination. Also, with BetterHelp, you can switch therapists at any time at no additional cost. Go to our sponsor, betterhelp.com/MrBallin, for 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp, and get matched with a therapist who will listen and help. Two weeks would pass by, and Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 prospectors did not show up at that outpost that Chief Eerie had pointed out, which was on the other side of the San Juan Mountains. That was going to be their first official stop before they continued the rest of the way to Breckenridge. And then another 2 weeks went by, and still they did not show up at the outpost, and they didn't show up at any of the other camps in the surrounding areas. Now, Alfred's big plan for this group was really dependent on the weather holding up. When they left, it was true that the weather was improving, it was snowing less, but within a couple of days of this group setting off on the trip, those winter storms came back with a vengeance and just dumped snow all over the valley and all across the trail this group would have been on in their attempt to leave. But the only people who knew that these men had embarked on this perilous journey was the men themselves, and then also Chief Eerie and the other gold prospectors who had decided to stay in the valley until spring. But even if Chief Eerie and those other prospectors knew that Alfred, Israel, and the others were in trouble, they would have no way of helping them or getting to them or even communicating to the outside world. They were completely stuck in the valley and basically couldn't do anything. And so in short, it appeared that Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 men were totally lost somewhere out in the wild, but nobody knew. But that would all change on April 16th, 1874, roughly 2 months after Israel, Alfred, and the others had begun what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey. That morning, a group of officials who manned the outpost that Israel and Alfred and the others were supposed to go to, they were having breakfast in one of the outpost's little log cabins. And as they're eating and talking to each other, suddenly from behind them, the door to the cabin flies open, and these officials, they turn around and they see standing in the doorway is this totally disheveled looking guy with long hair that's sticking up in the air and a huge bushy beard. And in one hand, he's got a rifle, and in the other hand, he's got a metal coffee pot. And his eyes were darting like crazy side to side, and he was clearly in shock, and he was trying to speak, but he just couldn't. This man was Alfred. And it was obvious to the officials that this man is in dire need of help. And so without even asking him any questions, they whisked him inside, shut the door, got him some food, got him some water, and immediately Alfred's wolfing down the food as fast as he can until he began vomiting, at which point he apologized profusely and said, I've been starving out in the wild for weeks, and it must have done something to my intestinal tract, it's probably damaged. But frankly, the officials did not care about the fact that he threw up all over the ground. They were worried this guy was going to die right then and there. And so the officials helped Alfred get cleaned up and put in warm clothes. And then Alfred asked them, do you have any whiskey? I want to kind of warm my body up. And they said, no problem. They handed him some whiskey. And so Alfred threw a couple of shots back. And then after that, it was pretty obvious that Alfred had kind of relaxed a little bit. And then at that point, one of the officials asked Alfred, what happened to you? As soon as Alfred was asked this question, he shut his eyes and kind of grimaced, like even the thought of what had happened to him was just too painful to think about. But after a moment of silence, Alfred, with his eyes still closed, told the officials that he had been with 5 men and they were trying to hike their way out of the valley to get to Breckenridge, Colorado to look for gold. But as they were hiking this trail, this huge storm came in and made it really hard to navigate the trail they were on. And so the group decided they would actually cut through the San Juan mountain range, the thing Chief Eerie said, don't do that, do not go over the mountains. They decided to do that. But as they were traversing these treacherous mountains, it was clear that Alfred was just not keeping up with the group. And so unfortunately, they made the decision to leave Alfred behind to die. And he knew he was being abandoned to die. And so he had to watch as his 5 friends, disappeared into the snow. But amazingly, Alfred did not die. Instead, he would spend the next nearly 2 months stumbling through the snowy forest, having no idea where he was going, eating roots and flowers and looking for shelter any chance he got. But the thing that really allowed him to survive out in the wild was when he was abandoned by the 5 others, he was in possession of that coffee pot that had the coals inside of it. And so at night, he was able to start fires. And then also at one point, he was so hungry that he cooked his leather shoes in the fire and ate them because, again, this guy is starving. And so really, he was on the brink of death when he randomly stumbled into this outpost and found this cabin. After Alfred finished telling his story, the officials were just totally shocked and silent. And Alfred eventually would ask them a question. He would say, "Have any of my men come through here? Did anybody else survive?" And they would say, "No, it's only you. We have not seen anybody else." Now, the officials did not send out a search party right away, mostly because it seemed kind of obvious that Alfred's men were likely dead by this point. It's been 2 months since they started that journey. The chances are just not good that they have survived. But even if these other men were not dead yet, the officials had no idea where to begin their search. They knew that if they actually wanted to go looking for these guys, they would need Alfred to lead the search because he's the only one who knows where they could be. But Alfred was not healthy enough to go out in the wild and lead a search. And so for several weeks, Alfred just stayed in the outpost, resting and recovering. And then finally, when he was healthy enough, he would go out and lead a search party to go find the missing men, but unfortunately, he couldn't find anything. And so it wasn't until that summer, when all the snow had finally melted, that the mystery was finally solved about what happened to those other men. On August 20th, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through a forest in western Colorado, roughly in the area where those other prospectors would have been walking on their attempt to leave the valley. And as John Randolph was walking through that area, he began smelling this horrible smell. And so John followed the smell until it brought him to this clearing, and then in the clearing was what looked like an old beat-up campsite. And so, being curious, John walked into the clearing to see who was in this campsite, but when he turned the corner and saw what was on the ground in the middle of this campsite, he froze, because on the ground in the middle of this campsite were 5 dead men all lying perfectly in a row. They were the source of the terrible smell. And right away, even though John was in shock from what he's seeing, he could tell that these 5 men did not die from something natural. One guy was missing his head altogether, and the other 4 had obvious signs of something being smashed really hard, probably repeatedly, into their heads. But that wasn't all. The other thing John immediately noticed is that the 5 bodies were in very different states of decay. 2 of the bodies were basically skeletons, but the other 3 were not. They were basically intact. Their chests had been cut and flayed open, but they all looked like they had died somewhat recently. In fact, one of the men looked so lively that it seemed like he was just sleeping, despite the gaping wound in his chest and his head that clearly indicated he was dead. Now, John wanted to turn and run away, but he had this morbid curiosity. He wanted to know what he was even looking at. What happened to these guys? And so, kind of against his better judgment, he walked a little bit closer to the bodies, and when he got close enough, he noticed something else that was totally off about the scene. When he was looking down at these men, he could tell that the wounds they had sustained, especially in their chest, looked surgical, like whoever had wounded them, whoever had cut them, had done so with an incredible amount of precision. This was not random hacks that got these guys killed. This was like a butcher carving up meat. And then John happened to look up from these 5 bodies, and he noticed just a little ways away was the remains of a burned out fire pit. And then there was a trail that kind of led off into the woods behind the fire. And so again, John, he wants to run, but he can't help but be really curious. And so he walked past the bodies, he went to the fire pit, and he followed that trail kind of back into the woods, and he found this ramshackle shelter kind of tucked away in the woods that was abandoned. No one was in there, but it had all the signs of someone living here for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, it was like all these pieces came together, and John realized what he had just stumbled on. Clearly, those 5 men had been murdered, and the person who murdered them very likely lived in this camp. And over the course of what looks like weeks or months, this person was butchering these men and then cooking their body parts over that fire and eating them. This is like a cannibal camp. And John, he's thinking, is this guy gonna come back? Whoever lives here, are they coming back soon? He didn't know. And so kind of in a panic, he pulled out a sketchbook, he sketched the area, and then he turned and sprinted out of there to go find help. It would turn out John the illustrator was totally correct about what he thought was happening at that camp. After Alfred was left behind to die, those 5 other men carried on into the night up into the mountains, and then somebody attacked them, began killing them, and eating them. And that person was Alfred. That was why Alfred had survived for so long. It wasn't just that he was able to make fires at night, it was that he was able to make fires at night and eat his friends. Now, no one has ever been able to actually determine how Alfred went about killing these 5 men, or even when he killed these 5 men. All we know is that based on the investigation, 4 of his victims appeared to have been asleep when they were murdered, but the 5th victim, who actually was Israel, the one guy who really liked Alfred and looked out for him and was kind of like a father figure to him, he was the only one who showed signs of a big struggle before he was murdered. While Alfred denied killing all 5 of the men, he said that he basically only killed one of them and it was self-defense, and somebody else killed the other 4. It was kind of confusing. Despite those claims he had, the one thing Alfred never denied was the cannibalism. In fact, Alfred straight up told authorities that he grew to really like the taste of human meat. In fact, when they searched that campsite that John Randolph found, they would find the remains of a dead deer that was right near the campsite. But despite it being right there, Alfred never attempted to carve it up and eat it. He just kept going back to his stockpile of human meat and eating that. In the end, Alfred was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But in 1901, when he was 92 years old, he was granted parole, and right away, Alfred became a vegetarian and then died a few years later. From the 1800s all the way through the 1900s, Bodmin's St. Lawrence Hospital was one of the largest running asylums in all of England. But in 2002, it was permanently shut down due to so many accusations of patient mistreatment. Now, after it was shut down, the property kind of fell into disrepair. It was basically abandoned. And so when it became totally overgrown, it began attracting vandals and urban explorers. And so the owners of the property finally just put up a fence all the way around the hospital, and they hired security guards to patrol the property at night to keep vandals out. And so these security guards began doing that, and very quickly, they began reporting that they were seeing and hearing things they couldn't explain on this property. They'd hear things like footsteps on floors that they knew were vacant, or they'd hear doors slamming, and at least one guard claimed to have seen a gurney roll into the hallway from a room, but then when he checked the room, there was nobody in there. But perhaps the scariest account came from a security guard who, when he showed up for work that night, he was feeling kind of sick. And so when he was out walking the property, he found somewhere to lay down in one of the smaller hospital buildings. And as he was laying there with his eyes closed, he began hearing a tapping sound coming from outside. And so he stood up and he walked over to the window and he looked out into the night, but he couldn't see anything out there that would cause this tapping sound. And so he shrugged and turned back around to go lay down again. But when he turned around, standing in this room with him was this skinny woman wearing a white hospital gown, and she had this grimy black hair that was covering her face. And so the security guard is just staring at her, totally terrified. And before he could do anything, this woman just turns and walks into a wall and vanishes.